very pleased for our first conversation, which I'll be moderating, to have Dr. Arthur Evans with us. On my right, your left. Dr. Evans is the Commissioner of Philadelphia's Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability. If you write his title, please note that disability is with a cap A in the middle. I guess that really sets you off for Google. Yes, it does. It's a healthcare agency that its annual budget is about $1 billion. And Dr. Evans is really one of the visionaries in the field of public health. He's been recognized nationally for his work in behavioral healthcare policy, transformation of service delivery systems. He's been recognized by the White House as an advocate for action by the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And he served in a number of national leadership roles. I won't list the whole number. They're in your program agenda in his bio. Most interestingly, he's president of the board of directors of the New England Institute of Addiction Studies. And I guess this is also health related in the sense that in 2014, the Melville Charitable Trust, which focuses on ending homelessness, invited Dr. Evans to become a member of its board of directors. Before coming to Philadelphia, he was Deputy Commissioner for the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, where he led major strategic initiatives for the Connecticut behavioral healthcare system. He also holds faculty appointments at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, and has been at Yale and Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. So without further ado, what we're going to do is Dr. Evans will give us a short presentation on PowerPoint. He's going to sit down, we'll have a quick conversation, and then open it up for Q&A. We only have 45 minutes for these sessions, so we hope they'll run smoothly, quickly, and provocatively to give you guys time to ask good questions. Dr. Evans?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, so probably the first question you have is, why is Philadelphia becoming a trauma-informed city? Did any of you watch the Cowboy Eagles game? Okay, that's why. It's not how we lose. It's not the fact that we lose. It's how we lose. And Philadelphians hate losing to Dallas. I mean, we can't stand it. So we have a traumatized city right now. Our people are really busy. They get you right to the goal line. You think they're going to win, and they blow it. So anyway, that's why we're trauma-informed. So anyway, I have about 15 minutes. And what I'm going to do is try to give you an overview. And I was fortunate to be here yesterday, so I heard a little bit about yesterday of folks who were really talking about down to the neuroscience level and programmatic level. I want to take you up 10,000 feet and to talk about, given all we know about trauma, how do you try to put all of those things together so that you have a comprehensive way from the perspective of a city or some other jurisdiction to address trauma. So that's what I'm going to try to do in the time that I have. I will warn you that given the amount of time that I have, that I am just going to cover the treetops. I have my communications director, Kim Rimshaw, in the back, who can also help follow up for any of the things that you want to get more information on. So always like to acknowledge that lots of people help that. I'm going to start with this premise, that hurt people hurt people. We have lots of research that shows that if we want to reduce violence, one of the things we have to think about is how do we interrupt the cycle of violence? People who are most likely to commit gun violence, people who are involved in domestic violence, people who are abusive with their kids, all disproportionately have histories of being victimized and being victims of violence. And so this idea that one part of a comprehensive strategy of reducing violence in cities has to be, how do we deal with the aftermath? Everybody with me so far? One of the things you have to understand about me, I'm Baptist, so when I'm talking to you, I really want you to talk back to me, okay? So thank you. I appreciate that. All right. So as I said, we're trying to become a trauma-informed city, and for us, that means a few things. One is, it means how do we infuse trauma-informed thinking into public policy? It means how do we build a infrastructure that addresses issues of trauma, and it also means empowering communities. To understand how we're approaching this in Philadelphia, you have to understand how we historically have dealt with the issue of trauma and behavioral health in general. I maintain that what we have, the mental model that we have for what we do is a black box. And basically the way it works is this. We build a black box called treatment. When people get sick, i.e. they get traumatized, they come to treatment, we treat them, and then we discharge them, and we assume that they're well. That's basically the way behavioral health care works. It's really the way healthcare works in general. And it's the way we historically have dealt with trauma. Would you agree with this? Well, you have to say yes or I don't have a presentation. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so this is basically the way that we've dealt with it. Well, it turns out that there are a lot of problems with this paradigm for treating trauma, behavioral health in general, but trauma in particular. So let me point out some of them. One of them is that it assumes that people will recognize that they are traumatized, that they're suffering from trauma, that they will know where to get help, they will know how to get help, that they will meet the criteria, because you can't get into this box unless you have a diagnosis. And keep in mind that 25% of the population has a mental health diagnosis, 75% doesn't. So this model ignores the other 75% of the population. It also assumes that people are fixed when they leave, and it assumes that when people get into the box, that they are in the right box. And one of the things, if you know anything about behavioral health systems, is that depending on what door you walk through, that's the issue that people are going to focus on. So if you walk through a substance use store, that's what people are going to focus on. If you walk through a mental health door, they're going to focus on that. And I'm going to tell you why that's problematic in a moment. Well, let me just point out a couple of other things. This is a very passive model. This model waits for people to come to it, okay? So what we've tried to do is to take what the science tells us about trauma and use that to inform how we approach on a large scale the issue of addressing trauma. So let me give you a little bit of background. One of the things that is important to know is that people experience trauma in lots of different ways and lots of different intensities. And so if you're setting up a trauma-informed system or community, you have to think about the whole range of ways that people are traumatized, from mass casualty situations to people witnessing gun violence to domestic violence. There are people who have experienced trauma early in life who are now 20, 30 years later still dealing with those issues. And so there's a whole range of traumatic experiences, and they're very diverse. And so we have to set up ways of dealing with that diversity. Secondly, the effects of trauma manifest themselves in different ways. Most people think about post-traumatic stress disorder. So when people think about the impact of trauma, they think about PTSD. The reality is that people will manifest trauma in different ways. Some people will become depressed. Some people will have anxiety disorder. Many, many people will develop substance use disorders. If you go to our drug treatment programs, overwhelmingly, particularly for women, they have very significant trauma histories, sexual abuse early in life, and so forth. And people self-medicate to deal with that. So you have to have a way of identifying and seeing people, meeting them where they are. That there are multiple and different types of interventions. Primarily in our field, we have two ways of intervening: psychotherapy and pharmacology. Those are the basic two ways. The reality is that there are many other ways that we can be helpful to people, and that part of what we've had to do is to think creatively about what are the other ways that we can intervene. And then lastly, and this point was made yesterday, I thought there were some great presentations yesterday, that communities and systems can prevent, contribute to, and mitigate the impact of trauma. That it's not just about treatment, but how organizations, systems respond can also impact on trauma. So we've tried to reframe from the treatment-centric black box to a population health approach where we're really thinking about the entire population, not just the individual, but the family and neighborhoods and communities, so that our approach is not just intervening at the individual level, but really thinking about the entire population. Everybody with me so far? Okay, thank you. Don't say amen because I'm a deacon. And that means it's collection time, so you don't want to go there. All right, so how do we then take all of this and put it into a framework to guide our work? So there are basically three areas. One is effective behavioral health services. Secondly, cross-systems partnerships. And thirdly, enhancing community capacity and community skills. Now, I critique the black box, but I want to be really clear that I think that treatment is enormously important in terms of addressing trauma. So we've made a huge investment in our system in infusing trauma-specific treatments. These are just some of them, from prolonged exposure, dialectical behavioral therapy, trauma-focused CBT. I won't go into this now, mainly because you've probably heard a lot of this, and I want to focus on the things that we may not be talking a lot about. And let me first start with strategic cross-systems partnerships and why we think those are important. So, the reality is that for people who are traumatized, they often find themselves in lots of different places, lots of different systems. And so we think that one of the strategies that's really important is to make sure that those systems are responding in a way that mitigates continued trauma, but also helps to identify people who may need help. So here are just a list of some of the major systems that we try to partner with. And I'm going to give you examples of some of those. Most of you have probably heard of CIT training, which police officers are trained. This is a huge commitment on part of police departments because in Philadelphia, commissioner takes officers offline for an entire week. They get trained in everything from hearing voices, listening to youth who've experienced mental health challenges. And it's made a huge difference in Philadelphia in terms of how officers respond to situations where people are experiencing psychiatric crises, but also in other areas. And again, I can talk about any of these things in depth. I'm just going to hit the highlights today. Philadelphia's trained about 40-50% of the police force. Now, in addition to the CIT training, all officers get mental health first aid training while they're in the academy. So they've trained about 600 people through that process as well. Child welfare. Huge issue in terms of how do child welfare systems respond to families and children in a way that they don't continue to or exacerbate the trauma that children have experienced. So one of the things that was happening in Philadelphia, for example, was that children were being placed in residential treatment programs, often as far away as Utah. So they're being taken out, so they've been traumatized. Judges believe they're doing the right thing by placing them in a residential treatment program, often, again, in communities in which there are no other people that look like them, in communities that are very different than their own community and separated from all of their social support. So we, as a system, child welfare, behavioral health, got together and said, this is something we need to change because we don't believe this is in the best interest of children. And so over a number of years, we drove down the number of children who were in residential care. This is a policy issue. This isn't a treatment, but we think this is really important if we're talking about being more trauma-informed. Today we have, I think when we started this, we had about 300 children out of state. Today we have about 10. Hospital-based interventions. Most people who are victims of gun violence in Philadelphia, and I didn't know this until we started working with Drexel and the creators of this program, John Rich and Ted Corbin. When most people are shot, they are bandaged up, and if they survive, they are discharged. That's the majority. And so people are taking care of their physical conditions, but it's really clear that there's a psychological impact. And so we've started and have been doing a hospital-based intervention program, starting first with one of the adult hospitals and one of the children's hospitals. By the end of this year, we'll have these hospital-based interventions in all of the level 1 trauma centers in Philadelphia. Those are the places where people who are gunshot victims are most likely to end up. Let me give you a few examples of strategies that we've used in communities. Then we can go into to Q&A. So one of the things that happens in communities is that not only are the victims of violence susceptible to trauma, but the people who are witnesses of those acts are also susceptible. And so a few years ago, we started doing community response teams where we train behavioral health providers in communities in psychological first aid. They go into the community in the aftermath of shootings to, one, signal that it's not okay for these kinds of things to happen, and to give people information about what is a normal trauma response, to support people, and to make sure that if people are experiencing traumatic stress, that they know how to get to treatment. Another strategy is working with our faith communities, because the place that people will go most often when they need help is their pastor, their rabbi, their imam. In Philadelphia, we have a very robust set of strategies that we're using with the faith community. We map everything in Philadelphia. So this is actually an old map, but it just gives you an idea of how we try to do this work. So we will look at the areas of the city that have the highest need and then try to focus in on those areas. And this is just showing that with the faith community, that was one of our strategies. We're starting to use technology to get to more people. As I mentioned earlier, the black box strategy assumes that people will recognize and know how to access treatment. The reality is that half of the people who have mental health challenges don't go to treatment. And so one of the things we've started to do is to use online mental health screening as a way for people to, on their own, go online. They can take a 10-minute screening. If they have symptoms consistent with trauma or depression or any other mental health challenge, it gives them information on how to connect to services, and it gives them now an option to actually do an online treatment, online CBT, as an option. And so people will quite literally be able to screen. If they screen positively, do a course of online CBT with a coach. And we think that that is another alternative. And what we're finding is that young people are very likely, much more likely to use this as a way of getting information about mental health. This website was actually created because we wanted to have a place that didn't look like a government website, that looked kind of user-friendly, and it's turning out to be a really important resource in our community. We also do community screenings, and last year we created the first mental health screening kiosk. So, you know, when you go to the drugstore and you see the blood pressure cuffs there, we created a kiosk, and actually this one is right next to the blood pressure cuff in a retail clinic. And what we were trying to do is a couple of things. One is to normalize mental health issues, but also create another access point for people. So this turned out to be pretty popular. We now have places around the country that are sort of emulating this. Drexel University, for one, was one of the first, it's actually the first university to take this idea, embed it within their student center, and they're getting a lot of activity around the kiosk. mental health first aid, one-day training. We've trained about 10,000 people in Philadelphia on mental health first aid. So that's 10,000 people who are in a better position to recognize, support, and connect people to services. So we think this is a really important strategy from the standpoint of community members being able to recognize when people might be experiencing trauma or some other mental health challenge and getting them connected. Community coalitions, won't go into this, but just say that we have lots of immigrant communities in Philadelphia and refugee communities. They have significant trauma histories, and one of the strategies that we use is to go to those communities and allow the communities to come up with strategies for how to meet their needs. Last example I want to give you is porch lights. So if you've been in Philadelphia very long, you'll see murals all over the city. Those murals are actually painted by community members. So a few years ago, we thought one of the big challenges we have in our field is the whole issue of stigma. And so we wanted to look at whether we could develop a partnership to use this mechanism of communities engaging around a topic to have murals dedicated to the idea of reducing stigma. And so we started working with them, actually got funding through RWJ and other foundations. And now we have a whole series of paint days and processes in which people in the community, this is actually one with veterans, come together, focus on a topic, and actually paint the mural. But the thing is that these murals have been a great way of changing public perception and relationships. For example, this particular mural was done in, there's actually a methadone clinic there, a lot of stigma associated with that. There was tensions between the community and the program. One of the things we know about reducing stigma is social contact. Can you tell who the people in this picture are the clients? You can't, right? And so we know that social contact makes a big difference. And so it was a community and the program participants who created this mural. 1,000 people worked on this over the course of time. The relationship between the community and the program changed such that on the other side of the mural is a community garden in which the program and the community came together to complete. But it's a great example of how using art has been a non-threatening way to engage communities around some of these issues. And if we want to really impact on trauma, one of the things that we felt that we needed to do was to change public perception. So sort of in summary, I think what you can see is that, at least in Philadelphia, what we're trying to do is to think about this in a big way. We're trying to think about it in terms of a population approach. We're trying to think, how do we get further upstream so they're not waiting for people to come to the treatment black box, but we're trying to intervene much earlier. And that what we're trying to do is really change how our community understands and responds to and develops policies that are much more consistent with a trauma-informed way of thinking. So that's my story, and I am sticking to it. Thank you.
Good. So have a seat. So I want to maybe put a couple of quick questions to you, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So one of the, first of all, thanks for this great treetops view. But one of the things that strikes me, just on hearing what you said, is that what you've basically done is you've broadened the connection points. I mean, you've gotten out of the black box, and you've given people the facility of entering the system at various points. So take us through maybe a concrete example of, let's take a scenario that a lot of us know well. We have a young man on the streets, been shot, police have a perp in hand, emergency technicians have come, they're about to take him to a hospital. How does your system in Philadelphia deal with that kind of situation as opposed to the traditional approach?
Well, I think if their intervention is within one of the hospital-based programs, what will happen is that social workers, clinicians will start working with the person. They will engage the person in addressing the trauma that they may have experienced.
Will be someone on site.
So there are
Someone's
people
called,
who are in the hospital. And so when a young person, and these are usually young men, is shot, people from the program will go to that person. They will interview them. They will tell them about the program. They will try to recruit them into the program. Once they're in the program, what would happen is that they would get treatment around the trauma. One of the things that probably isn't apparent is that a lot of these young men are scared. You don't think about it because their public persona is tough, but a lot of these young men are very scared. And so, we try to create an environment where they can address both their fear, the trauma that they've experienced, and deal with the clinical issues, but also, because they have case managers working with them, to also get them connected and their families connected to services that they need. One of the things we just added to the program is moving away from just a hospital-based intervention, but then connecting people back to the community, sort of, again, continuing to move with this idea that ultimately if people are going to get better, they're going to get better in their communities, and that the thing that we can do to help people the most is to help people to recover within the context of their community settings.
So how integrated is law enforcement? At that stage, that's the night shots are fired, cops come.
Yeah,
I mean,
so with the hospital-based program, law enforcement isn't really involved. Law enforcement is involved more on the other end of some of the other kinds of interactions that I was sort of referencing, in which officers, because they are better trained when they are responding to situations, we think that they're doing a much better job. And I'll give you a quick example. When I took the job, which was around 2004, mid-2000s, I was getting many complaints from the advocacy community that there were situations where people with severe mental illness were being shot and sometimes killed. And that was the impetus for some advocacy around officers being better trained. Today, Police Commissioner and I, who's Charles Ramsey, can't remember the last time we had a police shooting involving a person with mental illness. And the thing that I like about the program is not only that it's helping people in those situations, but I've been on police ride-alongs. Officers who are CIT trained deal with a lot of crisis situations much better. I've been in homes where there was a child welfare issue. So the officers are going out with child welfare workers. And, family is really upset. And these officers, they were just very impressive in terms of how they walk through that situation. So I think it's the kind of thing, again, if we're sort of thinking about how do we help communities be more trauma-informed, police are a big part of that. And they can either exacerbate or they can help mitigate trauma in communities.
So, big question, how much does this cost? I mean, is it cost more than traditional forms? And I see that you have a lot of private sector involvement, so is that crucial to the success of the program?
I think private sector involvement is really important. I think the cost actually is at least break even, if not saving money. If you look at the residential data, for example, we saved millions of dollars. Now, that turned out to be good policy because we think children are getting better services, families are being better served, but we as a system are actually saving money because we were taking those dollars that we were spending in residential programs all over the country and then reinvesting them into services that are community-based.
Can you put a figure on it? The annual investment for the city itself?
Residential, what you mean for everything that we're doing?
Everything.
Oh, it would be hard to know. And the reason is that a lot of the things, and I think this is important, a lot of the things that we've tried to do It's to embed them into the way we do business. So it's not like I think about this stuff as the trauma program. What I think about is the way we do our work being trauma-informed. And so we've infused a lot of this thinking into lots of different places. So it would be really difficult to sort of tease out. The screening, for example. Screening actually helps people who may not have a trauma issue, but it definitely helps people who have trauma. So that makes it hard.
So we've been talking a lot about resilience so far in the last 2 days, and one of the things that strikes me is that you're already talking about community resilience as well as individual resilience. Now, how does this factor into that? And even more to the point, how do you measure it? I mean, it's been going on for how many years? I'm not sure. Yeah. You said, but it's hard to measure and hard to present to the public, well, unless you say this is X number of homicides less than what we had 10 years ago. Are there other ways of measuring it?
So let me give you an example of one way that we're measuring it. So the mural work that you saw earlier. The mural work, I believe, and actually we have the data now to support this, works at the individual level, but it also works at the community level. And our field doesn't have a lot of community level intervention. So how do you change communities, right? So one of the things that happens when we do a mural project is we go into the community, we recruit and engage people from that community. The topics can be anything. It could be resilience. In fact, we've done a resilience mural. We've done a trauma mural. We've done murals on suicide, on a variety of topics. The community comes in, goes through a series of conversations, discussions, workshops, comes up with the concept, the artist. Have you ever seen the paint by numbers? So artists actually does a paint by number on these big swaths of parachute cloth. You saw that in one of the pictures. And then the community actually comes in, paints the mural. That is adhered to the wall, and then an artist comes by and finishes it off. So the community is very involved in that. So not only is the community involved in that, but it actually changes communities. So when the Mural Arts program does a mural in Philadelphia, one of the things that happens, if you go to Philadelphia, unfortunately, there is a lot of litter. One of the things that happens is around murals, you tend not to see much litter. People start to take care of that community and that area differently. And so when we did this work, I mentioned that RWJ was one of the early supporters of this work. We got, and Scattergood Foundation, we got evaluation by some colleagues at Yale who came in, looked at sort of before and after, and one of the things that they measured was community cohesion and connectedness. And we did control groups, so communities that didn't get murals and communities that did. And what that research showed was that in those communities where the murals were done, you saw an increase in people's perception, even by people who didn't participate in the mural, in terms of community cohesion. So we think that this,
meaning what? They took
meaning that people felt more connected to other members in their community, and so less isolation within the community context. So, this is an intervention that we think is not only helping the people who are participating, but it's also helping the community, I think, ultimately be more resilient.
So thinking of some of the essential takeaways, I mean, we have journalists here from all over the country who might wonder whether a program like this, a trauma-informed program, could be replicated in their places. I mean, are there specific takeaways that can be exported elsewhere, or are there conditions that you need to have either a sense of desperation before you can actually get this done, or it's pretty hard to impose on a system that already feels nothing going wrong?
Yeah, well, I think that everything that I talked about from a principle standpoint, I think can be replicated anywhere. The idea, because most of what we're doing is changing how we think about the work and how we approach the work. I think, for example, going to communities, rather than me as commissioner going in, say, to let's use, you saw the Burmese and Bhutanese community on some of those community coalitions, and saying, you know what, we have really great evidence-based treatments. We're going to put one of these evidence-based treatment programs in your community. We know that there's a lot of trauma in your community. We want you to come to these programs. It's not what we did. What we did is we went to the community and said, look, you all know what the issues are in your community. What we're willing to do is we're willing to help you come up with solutions in your own community. And so what the community came up with was, well, what we really need is a storefront or resettlement kind of approach, because so many of the individuals who come to this country from those kind of countries have all kinds of issues. So that's what they identified as their primary need. So we partnered them with a mental health agency, with a health care agency. And so when people come in for resettlement help, because they are connected to people who have mental health training, they're able to identify those issues and then actually intervene that way. So that was a much better intervention. And I think that that same way of thinking, I think, can apply to lots of different communities. So that's the way we did it in Philadelphia, but I think that those principles work anywhere.
So let's open it up to some questions. Raise your hand, say who you are. Let's get a mic around. We have right over there, Penny.
Well,
Thank you.
Better late than never.
okay. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that that's a complex question. What I would say is that, and the reason I started with hurt people as the sort of the frame around this, is that one of the things that we absolutely know is that if we don't interrupt the cycle of violence and treat people who've been traumatized, that they are much more likely to commit violent acts. We know that from child welfare literature. We know that from other literatures. What we're trying to do is to interrupt that cycle of violence. And we're trying to do that in a way that is comprehensive, that hits lots of different populations. And I think over time, what we're going to see, what we hope to see, is that this actually results in fewer people from these various populations actually being more violent. But at this point, I can't say that because of the work that we did in reducing kids who are being placed in out-of-state placements as parents. First of all, it hasn't been long enough. But as parents are less likely to injure their children, it's going to take some time to figure out. So I think it's sort of depending on what the population is. I think for the hospital-based programs, I think we have a much stronger case there. And in fact, that research, those programs are being evaluated as we speak. And so over the next year or so, we'll actually have data that either supports or doesn't support the idea that intervening in this way actually reduces the likelihood that these young men are going to engage in violence again.
Sorry, just a follow-up. So when you say the hospital-based programs, you're talking about the California
That are embedded within hospital emergency departments.
that talk to the ones like gunshot victims and stuff like that.
Right.
I'd love to hear like the effectiveness of that specifically. That kind of got my attention. I don't think you have anything like that in front of you.
Right. I think that program, I think, is a great example of trying to interrupt the cycle of violence. Because what our data shows, and I'm sure it shows in Trenton, is that the people who are committing gun violence are also the people who are getting shot. And so, we know that these guys, if there isn't some intervention, are really likely to be the next perpetrators. If not for anything else, they're going to retaliate.
Do you have a...
Sure. So it involves several components. One of them is group psychotherapy, trauma-focused treatments. Part of it is, as I said, case management types of service, because it's not enough to just treat the trauma that people are experiencing, but it's also important to deal with the life issues that these young men have and address those issues. And then a component that we just added was connecting these young men to services that are embedded within their community. So it's sort of all three of those.
So how likely are they to get involved
Right, right. So I think that that's one of the challenges is that as you're pointing out, a lot of these young men don't want to engage, but some of them do. And I think it's incumbent upon us for those who do want to engage and do engage is to engage those young men.
You
Okay,
didn't follow up with the parents? You did follow up with the parents?
There is work with the family as well.
okay, we have a question here, please.
Actually, it's not a question. We're talking about hospital-based intervention. In LA, we have a number of hospitals that are deep in, for several years, hospital-based intervention. And I'm glad you're doing it because it works. The key there is the intervention worker who's almost always an ex-gangbanger. And another key is that we don't allow police to get involved in the trauma room or upstairs before they wake up. It's also the job of the intervention worker to separate the factions of those who have been the shooters and the shootees, and they have developed so much of a rapport within the hospital staff. Now the hospital workers want these intervention workers to come in, want them to stay, and it lowers the level of recidivism of the guys that are coming back. Hospital-based intervention is extremely effective if done correctly.
Okay, let's move very quickly.
They have a question here.
Okay.
I understand that the Philadelphia Healing Hurt People program is the leader of a national network of programs in hospitals with 28 different cities, I think. So I guess the one question is, when are you going to be? When will you have some real data so that other cities might say, "Aha! Now we have some serious evidence of whether this is working or not"?
Probably within the next year or so. The research is being done by Temple University, and so in fact, we just got grant dollars within the last year around that. And so one of the things, because we were phasing these in, we have a natural sort of control group, and people really wanted to be able to not just say what happened with these young men, but what happened to them in relation to people who didn't have this kind of intervention.
Okay. Apart from intervening in hospitals where you have victims, is there a goal of this type of crisis intervention to reduce arrests of people on the streets or in schools, for example, for things like assault, disorderly conduct, whatever it might be, even drugs or something more serious?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the whole idea is, it really is a lifestyle issue for some of these young men, and so it's not just about the gun violence, which obviously is the main issue, but it's how do you get these young men on a different track, which is much more about being part of the community, hopefully getting employed, those kinds of things. And so ultimately, we should see in the evaluation that folks are much less likely to be arrested as well.
But are the police willing at those moments when there's something going on not to arrest? Or do they say, okay, I'm going to, work with you on this crisis intervention, but I'm still going to arrest this kid for disorderly
You're talking about on the
conduct?
front, you're talking about the officers?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the officers, I don't think that the officers, in terms of, are you talking about youth who are involved in gun
Yeah,
violence or those
gunmen.
kinds of things?
Not necessarily gun violence, but some sort of crime, lower level crime or conduct that gets kids arrested.
Right. Well, one of the things, and
Or charged.
well, first of all, I don't know the answer to that from an empirical standpoint. Here's what I would say is that when officers go through the CIT training, for example, one of the groups that talks to officers are young people who themselves have had social and emotional problems. And, the whole idea is to try to sensitize officers to what some of these youth might be going through, with the hopes that in those situations where discretion could be used, where a different sort of tack could be taken, that will happen. Do I believe that several-hour intervention within that context is making a huge difference in terms of how officers are either arresting or not arresting youth, I think that that's sort of a stretch. What we're hoping to do is to really begin changing the dynamic that officers have between youth in the community.
So we can take one more question right here.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the politics of putting this
Say
all
who you are.
together. Oh, Chris Speak, I'm from Nationswell. But in terms of putting this all together from a political approach, you mentioned that you're going to communities and really asking them what they want. But from an agency standpoint, what kind of pushback have you had, if any, and what's been most effective in convincing them to get on board with this approach and contribute?
Yeah, so I think communities don't push back generally, because I think communities, I think it's the way questions are framed. So most often communities know that they have challenges. And what we try to do is to ask, one, how do you define what those challenges are, and then how can we work together to resolve those? But I can tell you, whether it's the faith community, some of the immigrant communities, most of them, and a lot of these are communities that are frankly neglected because they're small numbers, and so people don't pay attention to them for political or other reasons. And so a lot of times these communities are looking for help and assistance, and I think our experience has been if we ask people to define what those issues are and to work with them, that has worked. I think, frankly, it's probably, if we were talking about pushback, there's probably more pushback from people within our field. So, for example, one of the things we say to our providers is we want you to be a part of your community, not just in your community. Well, for providers who have historically focused on what happens within their four walls, to say that now there's an expectation that you're going to go to community groups or that you're going to be a part of community kinds of things, that's really foreign. And so I think the pushback has been probably more from people within the field than people within communities.
So that's what I'm really interested in. And so what's the most effective argument to get those people on board, to convince the chief of police or school principals or whoever it is, the service providers, that they need to also be participating in this model?
Sure, I think it's impact. If you look at communities, for example, that the immigrant communities, they are very clearly addressing trauma in their communities that they would not otherwise have experienced. If we're talking about the superintendent, who we have a very strong relationship with, it's because they know that they have many kids in the community who these kids witness things. They come into school, they have a hard time learning, and in the absence of behavioral health intervention, those kids don't do well. For police, it's, the commissioner used to get calls all the time about, officers shooting people. He doesn't get those calls anymore. So you can sort of go down the line, and I think if there's sort of a lesson learned that sort of generalized, is that what we've had to do is to learn how to speak other people's language and look at these issues through other people's lens. When we're talking to the police, we're not talking about, wouldn't it be nice for you to be more nice to people? What we say is that, your officers are in really difficult situations. It's danger to them, danger to other folks. This is an intervention that might help them intervene more effectively. Same with schools, same with child welfare. We try to look at those issues through their eyes and then talk about solutions that actually help them accomplish their mission. Otherwise, it doesn't work.